Good evening. Our first song is 416. 416 Footprints of Jesus. Sweetly, Lord, have we heard thee calling, come, follow me. And we see where thy footprints falling lead us to thee. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where'er we go. Though they lead o'er the cold, dark mountains, seeking his sheep, or alone by Siloam's fountains, helping the weak. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where'er they go. If they lead through the temple holy, preaching the word, or in homes of the poor and lonely, serving the Lord. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where'er they go. By and by through the shining portals, turning our feet, we shall walk with the glad immortals, heaven's golden street. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where'er they go. 800. 800. What a friend we have in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptation? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful who will all our sorrow share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Are we weak and heavy laden, cumbered with a load of care? Precious Savior, still our refuge. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. In his arms he'll take and shield thee. Thou wilt find a solace there.
Let's pray. Dear God, our Father in heaven, we are thankful for this opportunity here tonight to be together and study your word, be with us as we do this. And Father, we want to ask that you be with those that aren't here for whatever reason, that you be with them and be with us in all that we do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Hello. That mic works. All right, let's open up to 2 Peter chapter 2. It's where we're going to spend our time. Again, that's 2 Peter chapter 2. I will get there myself. There you go. Now, here in 2 Peter 2, we're going to be spending several weeks in this chapter. But the Apostle Peter, he talked a lot about the gospel in chapter 1 and how it impacts the life of his readers. But here in chapter 2, we're now moving into one of the main themes of this letter, which is the theme of false teaching and false teachers. Now, with that being the case, one thing we should understand as we come into this chapter is that one possible reason Peter addresses this issue is because in chapter 1, Peter spent time reminding his readers of the gospel. They did not follow these cleverly devised tales or made-up stories, as we discussed. So, another likely reason Peter addresses this issue is because there would inevitably some that might argue against the truth of the things that Peter described in chapter 1 and an attempt to lead others away from the truth. So, with that in mind, in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2, Peter begins addressing this issue of false teaching and false teachers by giving a brief, concise description of false teachers and the things that they do. We find two characteristics in the opening verses of this chapter about false teachers, and characteristic number 1 from verse 1 that we'll look at is that false teachers secretly introduce their teachings. And characteristic number 2 that we'll see in verses 2 and 3 is that false teachers malign the truth. Now, after looking at these things, what we will learn is that we must learn to identify a false teacher, knowing that a false teacher, as we'll see, doesn't come from the outside, but actually comes from within our own numbers. And those are the things we're going to be looking at as we work through these opening verses of chapter 2. So we'll just read through verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2, and then we'll look at the points. So Peter begins in verse 1 of chapter 2. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be maligned. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So, 2 points about false teachers here. Number 1 is that they secretly introduce their teachings. Now, Peter begins this point in the first part of verse 1, saying that just as false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you. So the first part of this statement, false prophets also arose among the people. What's he looking back to in that statement? Who are these false prophets he's talking about, in other words? Not in this particular case. Something we should remember to help us answer that question is back at the end of chapter 1, Paul talked about I don't know why I keep saying Paul, Peter. He talked about the prophetic word being made more sure, talking about the prophecies of the gospel that we're looking forward to. So at the end of chapter 1, he's looking back to the Old Testament. Here at the opening verse of chapter 2, he's talking about false prophets arose among the people. So the question is, who are these false prophets if at the end of chapter 1 he was looking at the Old Testament? That question's for you. Let's say that again. Okay, the prophets that weren't from God, but in which context? Old Testament or New Testament? Based on the end of chapter 1. Okay, it might be the New, but from the context, it's probably the Old Testament. He says false prophets also arose among the people. He's talking about the prophecies that were given at the end of chapter 1. So he comes into chapter 2, he's saying in that same time frame, there were these false prophets that weren't from God, as Dina put it. That's during the time of the Old Testament. But now in the second part, in the next statement, he moves to the New Testament, to the present circumstance. There will also be false teachers among you. So, in other words, false prophets also rose among the people, Old Testament. There will also be false teachers among you, the present circumstance, the New Testament, as we might call it. But I want us to look closely at this statement. It says, false teachers among you. Where are the false teachers coming from? From the brotherhood. From within the numbers of Peter's readers. That means false teachers aren't coming from the outside. They're sitting next to you in the pews. Now, I don't say that to mean that we should look suspiciously at each other. I'm just saying that to mean that's where false teachers come from within ourselves is where they come from. In the same way that the false prophets of the past came from among God's people in the Old Testament. Questions or comments on that before we get to the next part of verse 1? Okay. So going on into the second part of verse 1, Peter begins to describe what these false teachers will do. First thing they'll do, Peter says, is they will secretly introduce destructive heresies. Now, when you do something secretly, what are you doing? You're not letting anybody know about it. You're doing it in secret. So this is how false teachers operate. They don't get up here in the pulpit. They don't preach their false teaching to the masses. They bring it in deceitfully. Again, they're sitting next to you in the pew. They're whispering in your ear, don't listen to what that preacher says. Here's the truth. They do it secretly. But the teachings they bring, according to this text, are destructive heresies. Now that's some fancy language there. But can anyone tell me what the word heresy means? Or what heresies are? No. Okay. Heresies. It's a fancy word for a set of teachings. Again, it's a fancy word, even more simply than that, for teachings. That's what heresies are. They're just a set of teachings that someone brings. But Peter describes these teachings as destructive. Now, when something is destructive, what does that mean? Okay, that's the result of these teachings, but as that ties in with the idea of these teachings being destructive, when something is destructive, it destroys you. In this context, these heresies, these teachings that come from the false teachers, yes, they destroy your relationship with God if you embrace them. But Peter doesn't stop there. He goes on and says that they deny the master who bought them. Now, who's the master who bought them that Peter is referring to here? Jesus. So, what does it mean to deny Jesus? In the Gospels, who denied Jesus 3 times? I know you know the answer to that question. Peter. But what does it mean that Peter denied Jesus? I think, Matt, you just said it. What did Peter say? He did not know him. So what was Peter doing by saying that? Denying his relationship. That's what this means. The denying the master who bought them is a way of saying that they don't even acknowledge their relationship with Jesus. Now, Peter's the perfect example of that. Now, Peter repented of what he'd done, but it's what he did initially. He disowned his relationship with Jesus. That's what these false teachers do as well. They bring these set of teachings, but in doing that, they're denying their relationship with Jesus. Because that's what that word denying means. It's disowning someone. It's denying your relationship with someone. So the picture Peter is painting here about the false teachers is that they're bringing in these destructive teachings, secretly introducing them, and in the process, denying their relationship with Christ. And so since false teachers are doing this, in the last part of verse 1, Peter gives the result of these things. They're bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Now, when something is swift, what does that mean? It happens quickly. So this is the result. These false teachers are quickly destroying not only others, but also themselves because of what they are teaching. Now, what that means in practical terms is that the false teachers are being separated from God because of the things that they are doing, the things they are teaching. And this is also happening because they are refusing to acknowledge the relationship with Jesus, as evidenced by their actions. Questions or comments on verse 1? All right. So putting everything in, Putting everything in verse 1 together, the point we should see about false teachers is that they secretly introduce their teachings. Now, in this verse, Peter has shown that false teachers operate in secret. Again, they're not necessarily going to get up in the pulpit. They're going to sit next to you in the pew and whisper their teachings in your ear. Now, Peter also shows in this verse that these teachings are destructive. Why? Because they lead people away from God, or as Sandy put it, they destroy the journey to heaven. Because these teachings ultimately result in people disowning Jesus, who bought them, as Peter puts it. Jesus bought them out of sin, but these false teachers are denying that relationship. So that brings us into verses 2 and 3, the second point about false teachers. They malign the truth. Now this point is introduced with Peter saying in verse 2 that many will follow the sensuality of the false teachers, and because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned. Now, does everyone have the word sensuality in verse 2, or does anybody's read different? You have indecent behavior? Okay. But does the rest of the verse read the same? Because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned? Okay. All right. So, first thing Peter says, many will follow. False teachers are going to bring in their teachings, and there's going to be some that embrace those teachings. But part of those teachings is the sensuality aspect, or as Matt's translation put it, indecent behavior. Now, that indecent behavior, whether you have indecent behavior or sensuality, whatever word you have there, it comes from a word that refers to things that bring pleasure to the senses. Don't confuse sensuality with sexuality. Two different things. Now, there's some aspects that are similar, but it's not confined to that. Sensuality is just being involved in everything that feels good. Now, Peter says that's part of what these false teachers are going to be doing. Many will follow. So, and since that's true, Peter says that the way of the truth will be maligned. Now, does everyone have the word maligned there? Okay. Now, what does it mean when something is maligned? What's that, Dean? Okay, it's out of whack. It's distorted. Blasphemed? That's good, because that's where the word comes from. It comes from the same word as blasphemy, something that is spoken against. So because of what they're doing, the way of the truth is going to be spoken against. Now, going back to the sensuality term, this is the same word that Peter used in verse 18, or will use in verse 18 of this chapter, where Peter says, as through the sensuality that the false teachers entice others to follow in their example. They use these sinful pleasures to lure others into following them, is what verse 18 will talk about, but we'll talk about that when we get there. The word appears in verse 7 of this chapter. He's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. They had these sins of sensuality. The sins are what oppressed Lot. So this word is used several times by Peter to make the same point. This is sinful behavior. But bringing it back in here to verse 2, this way of the truth will be maligned. Now, what is the way of the truth? What comes to mind when you hear that phrase? Okay, that's the gospel message. That is the truth of the gospel. But when we talk about a way, what's a way? Just that word by itself. How you do something. So the way of the truth is what shows you how to live your life. But what these false teachers are doing is they're speaking against that. and using these sensuality, these sinful pleasures to do that. It's their sins, the things they are doing, that speak out against the truth. That's a lot of information. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So with all of verse 2 being true, in verse 3, Peter further describes what the false teachers will do to those who listen to them, and says that their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. But before he makes that statement, in the first part of verse 3, Peter says, in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Does everyone have that same statement there in the first part of verse 3, or does anyone read different? Okay. So first, we have this concept of greed. Now, what comes to mind with greed? What is greed? Okay, that's one application of it, the love of money. Any other ideas with greed? What was that? Having more than you need, and what was said over here? All. Exactly. It's the need for more, whether it's money or anything else. So what kind of people are the false teachers according to this first statement? They're greedy. And because they're greedy, they're going to exploit people. Now, what does it mean to exploit? To take advantage of someone. Now, the word Peter uses here, it's actually a business term that refers to buying or selling. But Peter uses it in a negative sense to say that these false teachers are going to cheat their hearers. How, according to this verse? What are they going to use to exploit their hearers? False words. Words that are not true. So part of the picture Peter's painting here about false teachers is that they're not only giving these false teachings, but they're giving them because they realize there's something to gain from them. So they give these false teachings because there's something to gain from it. Peter doesn't tell us what, but it doesn't change the point. They know they have something to gain, so they use false words to gain something from their victims. And it's all out of this mindset of greed. Now, let me give you an example. We've heard of televangelists. It's people that are saying, give money to this, this, and this. That's part of this. Greed. Because you do the research with some of these people, and they're the ones getting the money. So they use these false words, these words that on the surface sound good, but it's coming from greed, for them to gain something, not to bring glory to God, but for them to gain something from themselves, for themselves. What's that? Peter doesn't say. He's only making the point that in their greed they will exploit you with false words. They have something to gain. They're greedy. Now, again, Peter doesn't tell us what. I was just using the televangelist example just to suggest a possibility. But Peter doesn't stop there. He says their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Now, when we talk about something being long ago, what does that mean? Distant. It's in the past. So what Peter is beginning to show here, these individuals, they've already been judged. But he says this judgment is not idle. Now, if something is idle, what does that mean? It's not doing much. It's not doing anything. Peter says You applying that here, Peter's saying their judgment is still in effect. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. Therefore, he says it's not asleep. So this repeats in different words the point Peter's already made in verse 1, that in doing what they're doing, the false teachers are bringing swift destruction upon themselves. But he's making the same point in different words. It's not idle. The judgment's in effect. It's not asleep. It's already been pronounced. It's coming. Questions or comments on verse 3? All right. So putting verses 2 and 3 together, the point we should see from these verses about false teachers is that false teachers malign the truth. Peter has shown that false teachers speak out against the truth in the things that they teach. Another way they do this is by causing others to follow in their example of sinful behavior that brings pleasure to the senses. Another way they malign the truth is by cheating their hearers or exploiting their hearers with false words out of that sense of greed and the need to gain something from their hearers. But Peter issues a warning. Their judgment is coming. It's already standing, and it's coming. So, putting all this together, the point we should see from these verses, from verses 1 through 3, is that false teachers possess certain characteristics. Characteristic number 1, they secretly introduce their teachings. Characteristic number 2 is that they malign the truth. Now, Peter's going to get into more characteristics later in the chapter, but here he's just beginning. So the application of these things to us is that we must learn to recognize false teachers. Now, based on what Peter writes in these verses, false teachers can be recognized, number 1, by how they introduce their teachings. Again, not up in the pulpit necessarily, but by whispering it in your ear, in the pew. False teachers can be recognized by how they speak about the truth of the gospel. They can also be recognized through the things that they teach and by the way that they are living their lives. Now, one reason being aware of these things is important is because Peter has warned his readers that false teachers don't come from the outside. They're sitting next to you in the pew. They've been baptized. They are among you, Peter says. They're not out there. They're in here. Now again, that's not to say let's look suspiciously at each other. It's just making the point that they do come from within ourselves. So with that being the case, these verses also teach us that we must keep an eye out for false teachers and realize that if we follow in their example, we, like them, will end up being separated from God. Because to follow in their example is to deny our relationship with our Master, Jesus Christ. If you deny that relationship, you deny your relationship with God. Any other questions or comments? I hope I haven't depressed you too much. All right. Well, we got a lot more of false teachers discussions ahead of us in this chapter. But if there's nothing else, Don, will you close us in prayer?